writing a book about Confucius and cinema. Now, I should say that my book on Confucius and cinema was in fact meant to be a chapter on a book that will be infinitely forthcoming called Global Philosophers and Film. And my first chapter was to be on Confucius and Chinese cinema. My second is on Wittgenstein, Derrida, Iris Murdoch, Adi Shankar Ayaya, and so on and so forth. But of course, this chapter expanded because you need to explain so much about Chinese philosophy, justify whether Confucius is a philosopher, see why he's been excluded historically, talk about the sort of syncretic nature of all the things that our colleagues have been talking about today. And so that grew into a book. And we can't really understand Confucius without understanding Taoism. Confucius is a Taoist in the sense that Christ is a Jew, I would suppose. He's not a Confucian in essence. And so that was interesting. So I wanted to sort of make an essay film for this particular context. I was thinking through the afterlives of Confucius on screen, the dialogues he has with other philosophers, particularly Lao Tzu and Marx, because they're the two kind of paramount philosophers outside of Confucius, I would say, in Chinese thought today. And thinking about his Tao, his life, his becomings, his the things that he does, and the way in which this under Xi Jinping thought gets recalibrated as a kind of a dialectical move that's linked to Taoism and so on and so forth. So that was my main idea. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the material thinking through film and how when you think through film, and I was talking to Rob about this as film essayist, you learn a lot more, and there's a kind of meditative practice to remediation, I would say, and thinking about media and playing with it. I wanted to think about that, the things that emerge through mucking about with film on applets, which is something to do with like learning to think otherwise, a care of the self. I was struck about how, Foucault, of course, is in his Order of Things, says it's the imaginary Chinese encyclopedia that he discovers in Borges that leads him to suddenly see that he's conditioned as a European thinker, and it's a revolutionary moment, but it's a fictional Chinese encyclopedia. So it's okay to sort of not understand Chinese thought because it can transform you anyway. And that liberates me to think, oh yeah, okay, I can go there. And I say this to Victor all the time. These books are like koans. I don't understand them. I get glimmers of something, and that's really rewarding for me. Victor, you are the dark sage of film studies. Yeah. And so in that sense, I want to sort of also point out that this is kind of what Francois Julien says when he goes into Chinese thought. He says, I'll never understand it. It's too deep. It's too wide. It's too complex in history. But in a sort of Sisyphean move, he says, but we must always keep going back and trying and understanding. And it's a humble thing to not understand and to constantly have to work to try and have something like an approach to knowledge. And I think that's part of what I wanted to work through today. So I wanted to think about that in relation to gestures of thought, but also gestures of bodies. And here we have this Xi Jinping thought vehicle in which gestures themselves become an important thing as Marx approaches Confucius in the temple. Confucius perceives that he's doing some weird Western thing by sticking out his paw to shake it. And Confucius himself condescends to sort of go, oh yeah, the Western ways are different, but here I'll meet you gesturally. And I want to think about the gestures of thought, and that's part of like the dialogue that we'll be having today. Both bodily gestures, which are of course linked to embodied thinking and perception, their relation to the social fields, to gestures of art and gestures of philosophy, and both the ways in which there's different artistic and philosophical gestures associated with Confucianism and Taoism embodied through someone like Lao Tzu. So anyway, the materials that we're looking at. There's only 2 films made in China about Confucius, one by Fleming, the poet of Chinese cinema, made in the 1940s when the Second Sino-Japanese War is happening. Millions and millions and millions of Chinese are dying during the Chinese invasion. He's in Shanghai in the foreign concessions. The Japanese don't want to attack the foreign concessions because it'll lead to a world war. So Fei-mu makes a film to rally the Chinese, and interestingly enough, he chooses to do an epic on Confucius, the thing that will rally them, because the Japanese have got Confucianism, but it's Chinese Confucianism that they've adapted and evolved. And then, of course, the Cultural Revolution kind of makes Confucius the persona non grata. He's associated with princes and hierarchy, nothing to do with revolution and the proletariat, the worker at the bottom, so he's abolished and destroyed. That is until we move into the 21st century, China rejoins the WTO, and we get the second film about Confucius, arguably in a post-socialist context. So we've got two films about Confucius that straddle the Marxist experiment in China, and that to me became interesting historically. There are, of course, non-cinematic representations. After 1989, when there's democratic protests, the Chinese almost have a knee-jerk reaction and make this what they call a tongue and throat, as to say, voice piece of the media, Confucian TV series to remind people about Chinese culture and politics and hierarchies and respecting princes and leaders. And that's the only one for a long time until we get to the Hu Jintao era, where we get the relearning movement that appears, and we start to get things like cartoons about Confucius for children, long form costume dramas for the television, and television movies about people like Lao Tzu. So these are the raw materials that I wanted to process. More recently, since Xi Jinping has published his thoughts on culture, we find TV manifestations of Confucius once more, and these are other materials that I started to materially think through as a video essayist, cutting them apart, creatively thinking about what they're doing, re-putting them together and making juxtapositions and trying to spot things about Confucius and media. So with no further ado, I'll put on a little bit of that film to show you. So Kiki, I think we had sound issues, and I need glasses to see. Okay, so this is the beginning of materially thinking through Confucius and his dialogues, his style.
孔圣人死去以后，孟雅圣首先调好香料胡椒，替他涂上一层；荀老夫子涂上一层；汉朝贾谊、董仲舒将他装成道士模样；还有赵普请他治天下。康有为请他充当政客，当教主；戴季陶先生请他收孙中山先生为弟子。
因为一切这三个水桶都是空的，中间虚空，偏斜不正。若是桶内不加上水，仲有
从中国皮影戏到电光电影，孔子直到1940年才首次登上中国荧幕。最早是在费穆的国防电影中，孔子被塑造成一座青铜钟，声音洪亮，世袭传统，恰逢其时。
不要太满，也不要太少，自其中就正，这就是无共无不及，中庸。
加进一选择选个有其有
Victor's mic.
地方地铁叛道之中受之了，给我杀！
他被塑造成国家的光复哲学家，乐于敲响战鼓。
这水头就翻倒了，小事做的，大事不下，太过太快，会翻倒。
Okay, so hopefully you get a sense of how the sort of Confucius gets manifested and made to be different things at different ages. And, you know, there's the story about the old Taoist butchers in their ding who can cut through oxen meat without kind of touching the sides. I kind of felt after watching these two films, when you're thinking about the lessons that Confucius teaches, that weirdly these two scenes kind of spoke to me as weirdly resonant. And in one, interestingly enough, in Famous, where you're in the context of real war, Confucius is talking about water and the flows of water, and the one in which China's metaphorically in the global capitalist, every state for themselves economy. We have this kung fu version of Confucius who's happy to pour boiling vats of fire onto those who threaten the state, the traitors of Lu. So I find that like incredibly interesting to work through and to see. And that also got me obviously thinking about you know, fire and water and Chinese culture. Just as a point, in case we don't get to the end, it was interesting as well for me to think about the Confucian shadow plays. The last piece of footage that I end the film with as such is another modern reimagining where Confucius, or the ghost of Confucius, encounters himself as an AI hologram who's memorized and now knows all of Confucianism for 2,500 years, and he can actually out-Confucius Confucius, and he's a tech commodity form. So for me it was interesting that we could make a movement from shadows to light that are somehow harmonious, and recognise that, yeah, Confucius has always been remade and reformed and reshaped. He isn't really anything, he's a non-thing. He is the empty vessel in which the flows of politics inevitably come. So, you know, thinking about fire and water, I had to do my kind of history of hexagrams and trigrams, and you can put them together which way you will. Decide which comes first if you move from the future to the back and the back to the future. But interestingly, both of them tell us quite a lot about these two films if you read them, if you think about them as hexagramic films, which I don't, but I think it's interesting anyway. The other thing is that another sort of complementary dyad, let's say, that's bridged here, of course, in these two films, is the way in which the when and wu of Confucius, the military and the civil, the scholarly, are bridged. It can be whatever they need them to be in that given time. And in that regard, it's interesting to think of like what Confucius is in these films. In my book, I'm sort of arguing that, look, these are philosophical personas. They are not real people. They are avatars and stand-ins for the philosophies that they embody, you know. Like, when Confucius meets Marx, what we're dealing with is Confucianism, as it's presently understood, beating Marxism, as it's presently understood. So we're not really seeing people meet, we're seeing avatars or embodiments of the philosophies that they stand for, which change historically. So that became interesting for me. I call them philosophical personae. I borrow it from Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual personae, but not all philosophies use concepts, so it seems a bit silly. But Deleuze and Guattari also point out that whenever anybody talks about a philosopher, they're ventriloquizing and using them for their own purposes, and that's worth bearing in mind too. So these are the philosophical personae, and Marx, interestingly enough, there. The deepfake they use is really glitchy, and you can sometimes see the Han actor underneath. And Xi Jinping is talking about Marxism with Chinese characteristics, and it's the glitch in the machine that reveals that it is in fact Marxism with Chinese characteristics, but also the actor's gestures given way throughout the whole thing. We could recognize Han Chinese gestures in the actor. It's not a German from the Victorian era. So the other person that Confucius dialogues with in all the films, and that's the last chapter I'm going to show here, is Lao Tzu. But Lao Tzu and Confucius are interesting conceptual persona. Lao Tzu is a conceptual persona. I mean, he's not really a historical figure. He's just an embodiment of Taoist philosophy. Would you agree, David? That was a yes. So he's already a conceptual persona. And it's interesting for me, like, what does he represent in relation to Confucianism? We can only really understand Confucius in relation to Lao Tzu. And in my book, it struck me that there was something interesting going on with bones in philosophy in China, all the way back to sort of inscribing on oxen bones, burning them and getting divinations that are linked to the I Ching and so on. But this idea of Xiang thought, image thought, bone thought that points to an image imagination continuum was really interesting to me. I like to read it this way because of my glasses. Xiang is originally an image of an elephant based on the layout of a dead elephant's bones. We can hear Herzog in the background. Our ancestors rarely saw a living elephant, but obtained their bones, and they just imagined the living creature on the basis of the image of the dead elephant bones. Hence, whatever our ancestors imagined is called Xiang, or image. The implication is Xiang is the pictographic character as well as the concept in the product of imagination. And this is obviously of great importance in understanding how Chinese image schemas work. Confucius originally wrote and read in a language called Wenyang, which was a purely imagistic language that didn't have an oral equivalent. You could talk about it and discuss it in different languages, but the images themselves were what he was doing philosophy in. He was an imagistic philosopher. I think that's important to think through. It strikes me that Fleming is also kind of doing this, creating bones of his film. Early in Confucius' film, we get this sequence of images, which we might think of as bones, that I invite the viewer to flesh out. He's historicizing it. But by so doing, by situating his Confucius story in relation to the birth of Christ and the birth of Buddha, he's kind of saying Confucius is on a par with these, or at least that's how I read it. So the bones of the film can make us think things in the imagination continuum, and I think that's an important thing to think through. But I also became interested in the sort of the calligraphy on display. You know, we've got English because it's made in a foreign concession, but the calligraphy to me was important. I started to think through Confucian calligraphy, and it became interesting that that has also got a style to it, or historically has had Confucian styles of calligraphy, that there's the way in which you hold the brush, the discipline in which you do it, communicates something about the ideas that you're also writing about or picturing. So in this case, a very disciplined use of the brush that avoids like little flicks and edges, is neat, solid, central, and the way in which characters are positioned on a page also convey a kind of balance and harmony that's very Confucian. And interestingly, I found out that that's quite different to how Taoist philosophers write and produce their work. So if Confucianism is associated with solidity and bones, it was interesting that Karl Marx is this glitchy thing. And just on an aside, Will Brown and I wrote books about cephalopods, boneless creatures, as well, you know how computers were based on the brain of an octopus and software comes from octopuses. We thought it was interesting to think through cinema as a kind of octopus. And weirdly, this Karl Marx, to me, looks like an octopus. It's disguising itself as something that is not in this environment in order to deceive or hunt, whatever it might be. So I was thinking about bonelessness, and then suddenly, actually, I thought, is there a connection here to Chinese philosophy? And yes, there was. There's a movement called boneless art in Chinese painting, or boneless calligraphy, and also boneless cooking, getting the marrow out of things, and so on. So I thought, well, okay, let's make a boneless chapter about Confucius dealing with Lao Tzu in order to have a Taoist kind of end to my video essay. So if you don't mind, I'll put on the last 6 minutes, and then we'll go. Like, Kiki, how did I do it without that? Yes. Yes. Okay, we'll just do the last 3 minutes.
人们就担心咱俩到底合不合拍呀？诸位说呢？当然合拍。我看未必。是啊，不过对于你我的相遇，历史上曾有过争论。马克思先生，请与我一步长廊，我们一起探讨切磋。诸位好，很高兴能与大家一起交流。马克思先生好，我是李丹。我常说“祸兮福之所以，福兮祸之所伏”。据说您也常用这种思维方式啊，可不是嘛？我管它叫辩证法。
中国文化几千年以来，它的辩证思维，或者说朴素的辩证法，它是非常深刻的。你看，我们读《道德经》，凡者道之动，弱者道之守，对吧？啊，有无相生，高下相倾，对吧？这些东西都是中国人的这种辩证的思维。实际上，当马克思主义哲学的辩证法来到中国的时候，又是一个成语“似曾相识”。
说到国家版本馆，大家不妨跟我去看看。何以中国文化流畅？
大家这边请，我们来拜访一位数字人孔子。
有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎？
你怎么和我长得一样，还学我说话？
我是您在元宇宙世界的数字人分身。我不仅跟您长得一模一样，还学习了您的全部思想。
全部思想？
是的，还不止于此呢。在您身后这2000多年，很多人对您的思想进行了诠释和发展，我都学习掌握了。
那我问你，
您
这个话题我们可以好好深入的聊一聊。马克思先生，请。
好，你们这个学的非常好，温故而知新，学艺更应该如此。谢夫子教诲。先生可愿随我到后世去看一看《周易》的流传？
好啊，
请。
Okay, I think you get the point. Yeah, thanks.